I work in a mathematical practice that rejects the distinction between membership and inclusion. It's, to give it a name, it's topos theory. Badiou has indicated, although I've yet to read this part of his work, that he's interested in it and aware of it. But to formulate a question, the approach you're taking, starting from Whitehead, that focuses on mathematics as process, is different from what I'm talking about, which I would characterize as an approach that treats mathematics as, in some sense, primarily about relations and relationality, and not about the elements. Therefore, it becomes possible to get rid of the distinction between belonging and inclusion. But really my question is to ask if you have any insights based on the work you're doing about just where Badiou stands on that particular question. When I first was exposed to his idea that mathematics is ontology, it was through Mediatheoretical. And there's really only a brief discussion of it early in the book, and when I read that passage I thought, this is just dead wrong. I mean, Badiou's just dead wrong. So we certainly share that fundamental assessment. But where our critique is coming from different places. But when I actually read Badiou, I became a bit more sympathetic, because he talks in a much more interesting way, in detail, about set theory, the appearance of Cantor's Mengenlehre as an event, as an historical eventual moment, which only makes sense in relationship to the conditions of possibility that constitute it, which is the Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. So I thought that at least leaves open the possibility that there would be a future mathematics discovered. Maybe topos has some relationship to that future mathematics that would reconstitute the eventual moment, that would reconstitute ontology as something which is mathematical and therefore outside philosophy. But now you've undermined that sympathetic reading, because you said something that I haven't quite encountered yet, that the event is something that that is beyond being. Now I can make sense out of that in Deleuzian terms, but I'm not sure how to make sense out of that in Badiouian terms. So I guess my question is to please comment on that sort of problematization of these questions, of these issues.
Yeah. I mean, what you say about Badiou as opposed to Mediatheoretical is interesting, that there's a kind of history of mathematics in Badiou that's a history of mathematical events, with the idea that, you know, like you say, there could be new events that would change the way we look at it, whereas Mediatheoretical takes it and uses math as a kind of, you know, general way of formalization that is not historical and that takes us out of history entirely. So I mean, I think that Badiou is more sympathetic on that point. Another thing I want to comment on first is, you know, I think in Whitehead, when Whitehead says that mathematics is process or genetic functional, as he puts it, I mean, I think he's talking about it as relations, right? As he's emphasizing the fact that mathematics is about relations, and it's about the potentiality of relations, right? That it will always exceed any actuality that will be produced, and the role of pattern. So I don't think he's thinking about it in terms of elements, right? So I mean, maybe it's more, there's more commonality with what kind of work you're doing there. I mean, in Badiou, you know, he says multiplicity is what is. You know, it's ontology. It's the being of what is, and that's a kind of criticism he's developing of Deleuze, right? Who wants to give us the production of an event as the production of multiplicity and so on. And so, in a way, Badiou, coming after Deleuze, says, well, all that you're talking about is what's really boring, and, you know, whatever. It's just what's there. And, you know, what we need to do is come up with a theory of the subject in his initial formulation of it, and then a theory of the event in being an event, where the event is something that's produced as a break from what is, right? And that's his distinction of philosophy from mathematics, or philosophy from mathematics / ontology, right? And So that's what I mean when I say the event is on for him on the other side of being. And I don't know if I can say much more, than that. I'd be more curious to hear from you, about like, because I'm coming at, like, I don't know that much about math. I mean, I've learned about the history of math and tried to learn about the history of set theory, but, certainly, it's for an outsider's perspective on this history. And I've been interested in it in particular in relation to the development of computation and the computer and so on. So, so I don't know if I have more of an answer to your question than that, but, I guess I would wonder if there really are mathematicians that operate the way that Badiou operates with math, right? I mean, is it, because it seems to me that he's using this distinction between the inclusion and belonging in order to get this axiom of the superset, in order to generate these paradoxes that show us why we need to go beyond mathematics and beyond multiplicity in order to come up with an account of the event or of being, and, well, of the event as a break with being, I guess. And, I wonder, I don't know, I guess I wonder, like, what this looks like to mathematicians. Like, is this weird, or is this, because in some ways, he's very clear, and he's very, he goes into a lot of detail, like when he's reading Paul Cohen or something. And I mean, it's detail that where I sometimes, at a certain point, don't understand anymore what's going on, and it's too much work to actually go in there and do it, right? So he's very responsible as a reader of math, it seems to me. So I guess I'm just curious to hear from you, maybe. What is it like from your standpoint? Like, I mean, does it make sense, or is it just crazy? Or is it neither of those things?
I'm not actually a mathematician.
Right.
I came to this practice through.
But you're trained in math, yeah.
Philosophy of science, mathematical physics. So I've certainly had a lot of exposure to the politics of mathematics, and all I can say, it's not really an answer to your question, but all I can say is that the world is divided between the set theoretic types and the algebraic types, and they hate each other. Mm-hmm. So the algebraic types would be very sympathetic to the project, although they might not agree in detail, mm-hmm. and the orthodox foundationalists like Pfefferman would think that Badiou is on some kind of new drug.
Mm-hmm. Right.
First of all, I wanted to say I really love the architecture of your paper. I just really love the way you really gave a really nice lesson on Whitehead, because Whitehead is just such a really unread philosopher, and I think the way that you just set up your your criterial base for the advancing of your argument was really just very clear. It was in the way it just in the pieces, the way it unfolded, and the key to it for me was, probably for most of us was okay. So we get into this future derivative stuff, and we have this argument that's going on between two thinkers with respect to the status of probability and formalized mathematics. I got to be more general, okay, stupid about the way to talk about mathematics than what you were doing with David, right? And the thing about it is I'm dealing with future derivatives with respect to a technological process. And the technological process, this is all taking place in the real time of computers and the decisions that are being made online. All right, so we are dealing, suddenly media has come back with respect to what this is all about. And so we're dealing with a screen on the one side, and we're dealing with this apparatus on the other, and we're dealing with this wonderful moment in your paper where you just started talking where the dumb and stupid suddenly made an appearance. And he said, well, I have this algorithm. I was taught in school what it is to adopt an algorithm. It's not that the requirement is to understand how pi came to be constructed or something like this, but there's a level of an understanding, which is almost as if it was like something you just accepted by saying, I just adopt this, and I'm a very smart person because I know how to adopt things, all right, in this kind of way. And I put it to work, and it did all these things. And it nearly led to a world catastrophe as a result of its being put into motion at such a great speed, right? And so it's at that point that media comes to have a surface like my computer, or what I do at work, where I have no access on the one hand to what's inside it, and I have no access to the mathematics, which in fact I've come to adopt to be able to initiate a process, or to be part of a process at an incredible speed, right? And so there's a little phrase in your paper, which was of course hilarious, and that was the idea that the market, whatever that was going to have a meeting and say, well, we're going to slow the whole process down here. We're going to have a convention, and we're going to say, you're going too fast. You're just going to have speed controls on this, and we're going to start legislating because the problem is probability. Right, and then we're going to start legislating with respect to probability, and we have to say, well, that's really very funny. But at the same time, it's not funny in terms of your project, because I think it's a moment you've brought up agency. This is where media, in your theorization, media agency actually comes to arise, right? And so that's what I wanted you to just comment on.
Yeah, I mean, if I understand it correctly, the way that these trades happen now is, entirely computational, and they're happening at speeds that are so fast that when something goes wrong, stopping it stops it way after damage is already done, right? So there's a way in which the system, even though it may be the case, I mean, what Ayash claims about that is that the computational agents are still informed by a strategy that comes from the humans that are programming them, right? And I don't know how I feel about that. I haven't thought about it enough, right? But in any event, there's a way in which this trading operates where there's a decoupling of human oversight from the actual operation of the trades that are being computed. And I've read some studies, and apparently minor black swan events. I mean, like they say, in a day of trading, there's like 2,000 black swan, little tiny black swan events where probability is foiled, right, as the thing operates. And so, I mean, I think it's a kind of a problem for this question of agency, and a problem for me that I'm only kind of getting at now, because what I was really interested in when I was doing this paper and thinking about this as a kind of development, I mean, I have a whole analysis of Whitehead and probability and potentiality in the end of my book. And so I was really interested in the way that derivatives seem to be a logic where the future is already felt in the present, and the present is already implicating itself in the future, right, in this very micro temporal dimension. And I haven't really thought as much as, I mean, this is really the problem that I now have, or the interesting problem, I mean, that I now have, which is, what does this say about media? Because in a certain sense, it says that media is toxic, right, that this mediation of trading by these algorithms, or by these computers that are running according to these algorithms, even the ones that take into account the limitations of the static pricing model that's at the heart of black skulls, right? Because I mean, they've developed since the crash, they've refined black skulls to try to introduce dynamism into the pricing. And Ayash's claim is that traders are like artists; they improvise, right? So they don't use this as a the good traders don't use this as a kind of thing where they're automatically implementing it like a computer would, right? So it seems to me I'm at a place where it may be that what I'm concluding, or what I'm facing, is a conclusion that it's the mediation of the trading that's the problem, right? And then where's the agency? And I think that's a really great question. So I don't think I have an answer yet. I don't have an answer because that wasn't the question that I was looking at when I started doing this work. But I think that it really is, for me, it's the biggest question, because I'm really interested in this whole notion of the logic of the future. And I got interested in this, from the problem of protension in phenomenology, right? I mean, where you've got Husserl saying early on, stop me if I get boring, but Husserl saying early on that protension is like retention. Okay, so you've got the now moment of consciousness, and it's thickened by the retention of the just past and the protension of the just to come, right? And you think about this as examples of melody, right? So you're listening to music, and you continue to hear as part of the present, right, what just happened, and you kind of, intend what's coming next because you've listened to music before, or whatever. And, he initially said, well, pretension is just symmetrical with retention, but this can't be, because retention is actually content that already, sensory content that already happened. Protension hasn't happened, there's no content there, right? So the only way you can generate protension is based on expectations that are modeled on the past, right? And so it's a kind of, that's the classical model of probability that Ayash is rejecting, and I think it's, too limited and doesn't work. So then I get onto Whitehead and I find this idea that, it's the repetition. I mean, in Whitehead, really, it's the repetition of the world. The massive repetition of most of the stuff in the world from moment to moment. That is, that has something to do with this implication of the present and the future, and then the potentiality of the present, of the present to create new futures. And this model is much more interesting because there's a kind of materiality that's the basis of it. And so. So that's what I've been really interested in, and it may be, I've been looking at, because the real model for this is quantum mechanics, right? And certain accounts of the way, like decoherence interpretations of quantum mechanics, where there's a sort of, there's a separation of compatible superposed outcomes from ones that are not compatible, and they're called coherent, and then they decohere in this process, and this is all taking place at the level of potentiality and so on. And it may end up being that this is a model of futurity where there's very little role for any kind of agency that would involve human. I hope that's not true. I don't want that to be true, and it's going together for me with a kind of critique of phenomenology and our phenomenological accounts of agency that tries to think it through microphysics and certain conclusions about relativity and so on. So I'm at the beginning of doing this, and I don't have an answer to you, but I find it a really, the fascinating issue that comes up here, and in some ways I think it's the issue driving the whole thing. Maybe somebody else can answer that. What do you say?
I had suspected from something you said, if I understood, I think it was the 7th or 8th chapter when you talked about the breakdown, the ultimate breakdown of the Black-Scholes model for the traders. You said it broke down, I'm oversimplifying obviously, but it broke down in two ways. One, they didn't really use it, even though they waved it around, so there was a certain hypocrisy there. And to the degree that they really did use it, it didn't work. Which ultimately led, if I read you right, to you got into some of the more complex diagrams later, but then also ultimately to the crash of 2008. In a sense, I was tempted to take away from that, but hesitated because I wasn't sure I was following it. But this conversation makes me emboldened to think that maybe I was. The differentiations you made between different forms of mathematics, set theory and infinity and infinities, many of the sort of broad and basic distinctions in the first couple of chapters of your talk, in effect, centered around the idea of functional computation. And by functional, I really mean in social terms. I'm able to compute, back to the Husserlian model, like Husserl-Bergson doesn't really, pretension is not, it's a thing you can quantify in terms of duration, but it's not really a quantitative model. You certainly can't predict the future in any kind of quantitative terms, and it's not a calculable kind of future in that sense, except in the ordinary sense of calculable rather than mathematical. If I heard this right, if I understand you correctly, it certainly seems to describe the reality as I saw it, as we all did at the time. These lovely lads and lassies who have our future in their hot little hands are treating something as calculable that ain't. They're treating something as predictable, as mathematically modelable that just plain isn't. And whether they go through the hypocrisy of pretending that that's what it is and screw it up, or actually try and use it and screw it up, doesn't matter. They're going to screw up anyway.
Right, and that's what we were discussing during the break too, that maybe the complexity of the market is such that it can't be mediated by these kinds of technical systems, right? And that's an interesting, that's an interesting position.
Well, the very last thing you said before I took the microphone was you're not sure where all this is headed. You think it might be called computation, you hope it isn't. I don't know how well a biblical prophet Nathan would fit you, but if you'd like to be Cassandra or Isaiah, these thunders would say, go ahead and try and compute. Thunder and hell will rain down if you do. New business, new job.
Yeah. I mean, about that, I mean, I have some things to say about that, things you're reminding me about. Okay, so my dissatisfaction with pretension specifically had to do with the fact that it can never give us something new, right? Because it's always an expectation for the future that's modeled on what we know of ourselves from the past and our past experience. And so the problem I had was how can the future have something new, right? And so here's where the break between human consciousness and then mathematics is something that we can use. Mathematics and computational mathematics, or mathematics embedded in computational systems, is something that we can use where we don't have understanding or knowledge of what it's doing. We have some knowledge of what it's doing, but we don't have, and so it as a kind of vehicle for accessing the way in which the new is produced, at least the way it is on Whitehead's account, as this prehending of the entirety of the world, and then there's an account of a kind of development of a subjective reaction to it and so on. And so this was sort of driving my turn to this Whiteheadian model, and I guess I initially thought that the derivatives example would exemplify that, and I don't think it does now that I've done it, and I think in fact it problematizes in interesting ways, specifically on the point that you guys were both making in your own ways, which is maybe the computational systems maybe it's not probability that's the problem in this classical model of modeling the future on the past, but the computational systems themselves and the limitations that are built into these. So maybe there's a kind of fantasy. I mean, maybe this is the answer. There's a kind of mathematical fantasy that's not that far away from Badiou and especially Meillassoux idea of mathematics as divorced from history, right? Where when we then critique that and actually look at computation as always making a cut between what's computable and what's not, right? So instituting some limitation on its ability to model the processes that it's going to model, we find exactly what you're saying, that the media technical computational systems are insufficient to actually embody the complexity by which the future is produced out of the present and is felt in the present and is constrained by the present, right? And I think Whitehead would be, that would work perfectly well with Whitehead, but it maybe would then kind of not let me say what I want to say, but whatever.
Fascinating talk, absolutely fascinating. It's set off all kinds of synapses that haven't gone off in a while. So, and it's namely because I have a background in mathematics myself, so I'm very curious about the flow of the arguments and the examples used, and what came up recently when you gave the quantum mechanics example, quantum theory versus the as an original case or some sort of inspiration for your own research. This is going to be winding a bit, so I'm curious about your own case. It's a case study. Is it crucial in itself, or because when I think of modeling in mathematical modeling of, say, the sciences, the predictive sciences, at their heart have mathematics, right? And in the history of economics theory, for example, there's a huge transference of mathematics. Mathematicians moved over in the 80s and 90s and mathematized economic theory to a very high degree. When you open a, economics theory book, it looks more like a mathematics book than anything else. So I'm just, there's this historical aspect which might be interesting, and I don't know if you get into it in your book, but just purely the mathematization of economic theory itself, which then would come out with this little formula for predicting derivatives and so on, which I find interesting. Like the formulas are always interesting, but they're a result of a huge process in mathematical reasoning to develop. It's like, for example, in engineering. Engineers are not mathematicians, but they build buildings based on formulas that are given to them by physicists and mathematicians in order to negotiate the world around them. So in a broad sense, I'm curious about economics, the mathematization of economics, and the use of a formula in place of this Whiteheadian notion of mathematics in general, which is a very big concept, right? Because mathematics, the way you were arguing, for this concept through Whitehead is much larger than, I think, the formula for a derivative, even though it is a particular example in a sense.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's right. For him, mathematics may be an avenue towards a kind of abstraction, but it's an abstraction that doesn't reduce, but complexifies, right? Or
Right.
proliferates relations rather than reduces, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, what you're really asking, I think, is like, why is mathematics important? I mean, in a way, why is mathematics important for me?
Well, sure. Mathematics in general, because that's the way it was used in Whitehead's sense. So there's this sense of mathematics. There are hundreds of theories of mathematics. So there's group theory, set theory, topology. Many types of number theory. There are all these different things. And it's aside from that, is how the humanities, people will use various types in all different ways, as you brought up, these complicated allegories or metaphors or figurative uses of mathematics, whether it's Deleuze and topology or Badiou and set theory. Their problems arise in this type of figurative use of mathematics, as I would say.
I mean, in the case of economics, right, the reason is that economics has always wanted to be a science, right? So mathematization makes perfect sense, reduction and so on, right? I find mathematics, what I'm trying to do is make a distinction between sort of pure formal mathematics and then practical mathematics or mathematics that are implemented in computational systems or whatever, right? Where decisions are made between what's computable and what's not computable, and what's not computable is left out, and so on, and then how does that operate? And for me, that's interesting because it gives us access to, if understood through the Whiteheadian understanding of it, to dimensions of process that we don't have conscious perceptual, access to, right? So it extends our access, right? So there's this paradox, which is that when we use these systems, even though we use them without understanding how they work or something like that, right? It's a kind of mathesis that we have mastery over without knowledge of, right? Nonetheless, they're extending our agency, and so we're in a kind of distributed system, cognitive system, or whatever you want to call it, right? And so in some ways, I'd say that's what I'm interested in, mobilizing mathematics for. And that requires, I guess I became interested in it by dissatisfaction with Badiou and whatever. And I think it requires a kind of criticism or a critique of the way that mathematics has been used, not only by them, but like these guys that are doing the naturalizing phenomenology project. So Jean Petitot and a bunch of French guys, and Varela was part of it, where their idea is that if we can translate the language of phenomenology into mathematics, we're going to have something that then natural scientists can deal with and whatever. And it's just crazy, right? In my opinion. So I'm trying to, like, I share in some ways this idea that mathematics is a kind of avenue towards extending our agency, and so on. But I'm trying to develop it in a different way than other places have developed it, and so on. And in fact, I've been reading about quantum theory for a while, and my mind gets, explodes all the time when I'm doing this. But I think that the understanding of probability, right? So you've got, like in the decoherence interpretation that I'm talking about, right? You've got the separation of non-compatible superpositions that get kind of negatively prehended, to use Whitehead's term. So you're left with a bunch of decoherent, compatible superpositions. They're mutually incompatible, but they're not logically incompatible or something like this. Only one can be the actual outcome, right? And once you get to that stage, then they get assigned a probability, right? And it's that sense of probability. So it's not a probability based on what happened before, on analysis of the past or something like that. It's a probability based on the shakedown of stuff in the domain of potentiality at that specific moment, right? And it seems to me that that gives us a much different model of probability, right? And a model of probability pointing towards future outcome, right? That's still a model of probability because it can't say this is going to happen for sure, this is going to happen for sure, right? But that's a model of probability that seems to me vastly different from what, you know, economists are thinking about and Ayash is thinking about in his understanding that probability is done with and so on. So I guess I'm interested in trying to recuperate that as a way of thinking about the future's inherence in the present. And I don't know, I'm saying a bunch of stuff now, but you know, it all involves formal methods of knowing, right, or formal methods of investigation that use the dimension of mathematics, although I want to insist in this kind of practical way where there's a decision made between computable and non-computable, and it's not formal, purely formal, as a way of extending our agency. So that's, I don't know. I don't know if that answers. Yeah.
And just a little, there's an aspect of calculation and so on that's every day. We're doing it now. Every time we tax. How about this level of the banality of
yeah.
You know, there is this, digital space is completely mathematical. So.
So that's where it all started, right? Because I'm like deeply interested in like the way that, you know, Google is gathering all this data about all the websites we've been to, or Facebook is gathering all this data about all our friends, and then using analytics to make predictions about what we'd like or what would be information we want to see and so on. And you know, I mean, I have an argument in my book that this is a kind of new stage in the history of media pharmacology where, you know, writing, okay, you lose your interior memory, but you gain a form of exterior memory. There's a direct relationship between what's lost and what's gained. It seems to me in the era of data gathering, this is so much more complex. So Facebook gives us instant connectivity, ease of sharing, blah, 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 blah. You know, what does it take away? I don't know, but it takes away our data, right? I mean, and there's no direct relationship between what it gives us and what it's taking away, and there's something sinister there, in my opinion. So it started with that, you know, what's going on in this increasing role, this increasing predominance in media of prediction and media of prediction and so on. And so I guess that's why I'm interested in I mean, Whitehead became really interesting, and this notion of real potentiality where if you have a kind of theory of prediction or a theory of probability, it's rooted in something material there, right? And so I'm trying to critique the superficiality in a certain sense of these data gathering processes which have to artificially close off a set of information in order to make, and yeah, so that's where it started. So I don't have a solution for how we can protect ourselves from Facebook, but I'm deeply interested in this kind of shift in media culture from the media. I think the stuff that Facebook and even Google offers us is a kind of lure for our attention with the aim of sucking from us data, right, to be able to do all kinds of things that we have no knowledge of and no control over. And that's the paradigm we're in, right? So again, it's a kind of negative, where's the agency there? That's the problem that I have.
My question basically comes out of an interest for your history and literature. Knowing that you've started at some point, or you've done stuff with cybernetic literature, looking at the enmeshment of reader, multimedial transformations of the text, and how does that somehow change or transform the experience of reading, right? Or how does that even influence our notion of what we consider digital or material or whatnot? And so I'm now wondering, what kind of, will you ever loop that argument back to literature, or do you see yourself looping those investigations back to a consideration of, I don't know, some kind of transformational fiction, or what would literature look like for you in an age that is increasingly mathematicized? Or do you see yourself considering literature again at some point?
That's the hardest question of all. I do, but it's a department of literature that really doesn't teach literature, right, as you know. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say something like, you know, I mean, I'm actually starting to enjoy reading more than I used to. When I actually used to teach literature, then I couldn't read. Like, it was not fun to read because you're reading because you teach. No, I don't like doing that. I like reading books. So I'm enjoying reading more, so maybe that's a good sign, right? But I mean, you know, like Whitehead has, I'll answer it indirectly. Whitehead's been of interest to a lot of people recently, you know, I mean, Steve Shaviro, Brian Masumi, I mean, a whole host of people. And a lot of them are interested in, a lot of them come to Whitehead through Deleuze, right? And so there's this kind of idea that Whitehead is a fellow traveler with the, I don't know if you'd call it anti-human, I mean, it's not quite anti-humanist dimension of Deleuze, but let's say the effort to get beyond the, you know, the mereness of the human and stuff that really is a marked, you know, it's different than in the anti-humanism of Damon and Derrida and whatever. It's a kind of disdain for the, you know, the human and the habit and whatever, right? And so a lot of people have taken Whitehead as a kind of way of supporting that sort of thing. And I completely, you know, Whitehead's idea is he thinks that consciousness, human consciousness is the pinnacle of the process that has brought us to the point that we're at in the evolution of the cosmos, right? And he thinks that human perception sense perception is the most efficient way of interacting with the world, although it's very narrow bandwidth, right? It only pertains to certain stuff in the world, right? So he doesn't disdain the human at all. What he wants to do is he wants to re-embed human consciousness in the larger context from which it comes, right? Which is why he says we need to supplement the understanding of sense perception, or perception as sense perception, which is what we've inherited from the philosophical tradition, with a notion of perception as causal efficacy that includes all of the causal vectors that stand behind, you know, I'm seeing you right now, but there's a whole kind of causal, you know, it starts with my body doing all this stuff that I'm not aware of, and then it extends into the environment and so on, and goes back in time, right, into the past and the near past. And so, you know, what he's ultimately trying to do is he has to develop a neutral ontology of entities in order to explain why the human is the way it is, and you know, but he is, that's his mission, right? And so, I mean, I think it was Professor Bordeaux, right, who said, or no, it was you, John, who said, I'm a human oriented or human focused or something, you know, and I think this is really right. Like, and I've been criticized by, for example, Kate Hales, my colleague and good friend, for, you know, being too interested in the human and not able to kind of embrace the technical whatever. And I mean, I just don't see it, right? I mean, I'm trying to complexify the human, like in the same way that Whitehead's trying to complexify it by re-embedding it in the context, you know, this broader context from which but everything else in the world comes too, right? And it's just the most complicated, the human's just the most complicated organism that there is, right? I'm trying to complexify the human by showing that we've always evolved in relation to techniques and so on, and that this is has a history, and it has a history of complexification perhaps that's extremely interesting, right? So, I mean, it's an indirect answer in the sense that what we do when we read is something cool and interesting about us, and I just need to find a way, you know, a reason why I think it's interesting again. But it'll come, maybe it'll come.
We tend to see different networked interactions with the world, or networked interfaces when we, you know, read in the 21st century, right? So the whole mode of reading has become, you know, a more networked,
right,
mesh, you know, co-crescent mode.
Right.
You know,
right. Yeah. So, you know, maybe it could be an argument like I've been interested in thinking about ways we can design environments. I mean, my whole argument about feed forward in my book is about the fact that consciousness is not there at the sensory moment, you know, when the sensory moment's happening, and data feeds forward into consciousness what already happened to us as an integrated being, and we can only take that in and then try to plan, try to engineer environments and experiences in the future. We can't directly intervene in them the way that the dream of phenomenology, that we coincide with the production of, consciousness in time in our present. This is done, right? So maybe reading in its 21st century instantiation is a kind of way of training ourselves to do that kind of thing, right? I mean, I could totally see myself making that kind of argument. So, I'm going to write that down. Yeah, thank you.
I have a comment that might be a bit peculiar. I was interested in your description of the practices of the traders, particularly when you put up a sheet or where it showed what they looked at, and so they didn't understand what went behind it. And then later on, towards the end, you talked about how the traders, perhaps the best traders, simply relied on intuition. I have to say, when you put up that sheet, I had a rather peculiar association. A long time ago, when I was a kid with my father, going to places like Hollywood Park and Santa Anita Racetrack, I looked at that sheet and I said, that looks like a racing form to me. And as I think about it, when you're talking about traders, you're talking about gamblers. And so the thought that you can't compute everything, that makes sense. My sense, I would put more phenomenological twist. You open the door with Husserl, but also John Fekete mentioned your interest in Merleau-Ponty. Perceptual faith seems to me what's going on here, or put it in another way, a sense of luck, which is surely beyond the computational. That's just my comment. You can.
Yeah, and interestingly, derivatives have been around for a long time, and they were illegal precisely because they were considered gambling, right? Gambling with the market. So, yeah, I mean, I'm unhappy about the conclusion of my talk. Here I am now, criticizing my own talk. I shouldn't do that, right? I mean, I'm supposed to be honoring John and whatever, but so I'm unhappy with the end of my talk because it ends with I end up kind of like agreeing with Ayash that the trader's some romantic figure that has this kind of way of intuiting the way the market's going to go, and maybe your understanding of luck is better. Like it's not that at all. It's just that somebody's bound to get it right for reasons that may have nothing to do with what they know or something like that, right? I mean, it might be that, and that would maybe be more interesting in relation to this whole discussion we've been having about the limitations of computation for modeling the market, as a media technical mode of action, right? I mean, so maybe luck comes back, and then it would be interesting to contrast luck with pure contingency, right? Because luck luck can be embedded in history too, right? I mean, and luck can reflect all of the variables that are going into a particular moment, right? So yeah, maybe there you go. I'll change the ending. And it'll end with luck.
Go back to the Renaissance.
Yeah. Yeah.